Hey, what is improvisation really? That is a question that really puzzled me when I started looking into soloing and scales and all of the tools that we use. And I really thought that people walked on stage and then they were actually able to truly improvise, truly original lines and everything when they played, like stuff they had never played before, right? But I moved into it, and then I could see that we basically learn licks, right? So we learn little lines, and then we put those together when we solo, and that's a great way of learning improvisation really fast. But it's like learning sentences, basically, right? A lick is a sentence, and it's a nice study of how you put words together. And you can go into it, you can analyze it, and you can really use it as a little chest of information about how to improvise. But then we learn these licks, but that's basically like, writing out sentences and then writing a whole book, sentence by sentence, by taking out bits and pieces. Like you have a chest of sentences, and then you take them out and say, okay, that's one sentence, let me put that together with this sentence. So it's fast, right? Because bam, 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 bam. But if you truly write the book from scratch, you use words. But that's what the next video is about. Right now, we need to define what is improvisation. I read about an investigation that they did where they took a lot of different players, top players in jazz. They took their solos and put them into a computer, and the computer was basically looking for patterns as to how many times does any artist repeat him or herself throughout their solos. How many patterns do they use when they solo? Repeated patterns like notes, like rhythms. And what it came up with was quite surprising, because Jaco Pastorius was actually the only one that really had, for the most part, what he played was truly original, was truly something he hadn't ever played before. So I was like, how does he do that? And that's improvisation. But if you imagine a vast field, that's the brain really within it, a vast field of hexagons that are put together. And each hexagon is a lick, or in the brain when we're talking, let's say it's just a thing, a concept. So if I say apple to you, what do you think of? You might say oranges. And that's because you have an hexagon in your brain that has an apple on it, and right next to that is an orange, a hexagon with an orange. But right next to that, on the other side of the apple, is a hexagon perhaps called grandma, because apples remind you of grandma. And right next to that is perhaps pineapples, because apples sometimes remind you of pineapples, right? So the apple is surrounded by hexagons that fit neatly into it, so that you jump from apples to oranges, but then the orange is also surrounded by other things here. So you might jump to that. And that's how associations work. Different stuff in your brain is tied together. What I'm doing now is I'm associating, but I have a point. I want to get somewhere. So that string of associations is guided by a direction. So on this vast field of concepts and things I could possibly say, it's guided by, so my associations are basically in the same direction. And we can really use that when we improvise. Because just think about it, when you're truly improvising, you're not thinking. You don't have the resources to think when you improvise. And if you do, you're out of it. As soon as you start thinking, you're out of the improvisation. You're out of the music. And that's because improvisation and thinking is using the same resources in the brain. You're associating. And you can only do that in one area of your life at a time. So when you're playing, right? Then you're going from sentence to sentence, and you have to listen for what comes out. What's the next thing that happens in the brain? And if you start thinking, you're using up that resource, and you stop improvising, basically. So that's the first recognition we can make, that improvising is basically jumping from hexagon to hexagon, is to associating. What do you hear when I play? What What's coming up, right? What's coming up in your mind? What's coming up? What's coming out of your fingers when you play that? What's the next logical thing? That's the next hexagon. So the question is, what are we putting into those hexagons? Because if those hexagons consist of licks, of little pre-composed sentences, then that's what you are going to associate back and forth from, right? Naturally. So that will become your improvisation. But if those hexagons consist of something more detailed, of a smaller component, because a sentence is a rather large component, right, of language, it consists of something even smaller, which is words. So what's the equivalent of words? Because if we could put words into those hexagons, those musical hexagons in our brain, then we would actually associate much faster. Because, putting together a sentence is, right? You put together small entities that we call words, which is basically built from letters. But we can't put letters together as we speak. That's too slow. So we put, because, A is, and then G, and then A, G, that's all too slow. So we use the alphabet to learn words, and then we use the words to put together sentences. So we're on the level of words when we talk. And if you could put musical words into these hexagons instead of licks, and don't get me wrong, licks are an incredible source of information about how to improvise, how to put together your tools, your arpeggios, your scales, your musical theory, everything, right? But if we could put together a smaller component into these hexagons, then you can improvise like Jaco Pastorius. You can actually play something truly original every single time. And that's what the next video is about.